He was just an ordinary construction worker, digging the ground with his excavator, when the bucket suddenly hit something solid beneath the rock. At first, he thought it was just a stone, but when he started clearing the area, what he saw inside changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and make sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The sun had been burning since early morning, a molten disk climbing slowly over the Texas hills, bleaching the sky until it turned the color of bone. The air trembled above the clay, heavy with the smell of diesel, dust, and sweat. Machines rumbled along the slope where the new highway would cut through the red earth, a wide scar stretching for miles, lined with steel stakes, orange flags, and heaps of broken stone. Every sound carried far in that heat. The metallic cough of an engine, the sharp clang of a dropped wrench, the echo of shouting men. For most of them, it was another long day under the sun. For Mark Wilson, it was another day trying not to think too much about how things used to be. Mark worked the big yellow excavator at the lower edge of the cut, where the soil was dense and mixed with chunks of limestone. He sat inside the cab with the door cracked open, the fan groaning against the heat, his shirt soaked through the back. He was a tall, dark-skinned man in his late 30s, the kind of man who'd learned to stay quiet and watch before acting. Years in the Army had taught him that. Measure twice. Move once. When the machine's hydraulic arm swung forward, he could feel the weight of it through the seat, every vibration a conversation between metal and ground. He'd been on the job for 6 weeks now, ever since the veterans hiring program got him this position after his layoff from a construction firm in Dallas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it paid enough to cover the rent and send something to his mother in Houston. The work was monotonous, but comforting in its predictability. There were plans, lines, safety codes, everything he could trust, at least until that day when his bucket hit something that didn't belong to the earth. He was cutting along the survey line when the machine lurched. The bucket scraped against something solid, not rock, something that gave off a dull, hollow clang. He frowned, stopped the hydraulic arm, and eased the bucket back. The sound came again, unmistakably metallic. For a second, he thought it might be an old pipe, but the tone was wrong. Too deep, too uniform. He climbed out of the cab and waved at Dale, the foreman, to kill the other machines. "What you got?" Dale shouted, wiping his forehead with a rag as he came closer. Mark pointed toward the shallow trench. "Something under there. Doesn't sound natural." Dale squinted at it, shrugged, and jumped down into the pit. He kicked at the dirt, then knocked the heel of his boot against the exposed patch. The sound rang again, dull and steady. "Hell, maybe a buried culvert or some old drain. Keep cutting. Careful, though. Let's see what it is." Mark climbed back into the cab and began to shave away the red clay inch by inch. The bucket brushed the layer clean until the outline began to emerge. A straight edge, then another, meeting at a right angle. It was too precise to be random. When he stopped and climbed down again, he could see it clearly. A slab of concrete, smooth despite the decades. Dale scratched his beard. "That ain't no drain. What's it doing in a hillside like this?" "Not on the plans," Mark said. The younger surveyor, Andrew, checked his tablet nervously. "I don't have anything marked here, sir. It's just solid formation on the geotech report. No structures." Dale spat in the dust. "Probably some old farm storage or a storm shelter from back in the day. We'll report it later. For now, let's open her up. Careful not to bust any equipment if there's rebar." They worked until dusk. By then, the slab stretched nearly 6 feet across, its surface peppered with hairline cracks. At one corner, A section of metal glinted beneath the clay. Mark brushed it clean with his glove. It was a hinge, thick and rusted. Beside it, a circular depression, half filled with dirt, looked suspiciously like a handle socket. The realization settled in slowly. It wasn't just a wall, it was a door. The rest of the crew gathered around, drawn by curiosity. Someone joked about hidden treasure, another about bootleggers. Even Dale, usually impatient, seemed intrigued. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "A damned door in the middle of a hill. You don't see that every day." Mark knelt and touched the cold metal. The texture was different from modern fittings, rougher, handmade. "Could be military," he said half to himself. "The seal looks reinforced. Old-style concrete mix, probably early 80s, judging by the aggregate." Dale shrugged. "Whatever it is, it's not ours. Let's seal it up for the night and call the district office tomorrow. They'll send someone to take a look." But when the sun dipped and the machines fell silent, no one called. The office was closed, and Dale wasn't the type to stay late filling out forms. He told the crew to lock up the equipment and get some rest. Mark lingered, standing alone by the trench as the others left. The light from the last truck headlights faded, leaving only the hum of insects and the faint metallic smell rising from the newly exposed slab. He couldn't shake the unease. The ground felt cooler there, the air leaking from the seams almost damp. It wasn't normal. He dug through every kind of soil, every buried foundation, but this felt different, purposeful. As he packed his tools, he caught sight of the name stamped faintly into the concrete near the corner. Houston Materials, Inc., 1984. His stomach tightened. He knew that company. They'd supplied cement for half the county's government projects back then, including the dam built under the supervision of Mayor Richard C. Holloway, a name people in town still spoke with a mix of nostalgia and contempt. Holloway had vanished in the late 80s after a corruption scandal, his assets missing, his case conveniently forgotten. By the time Mark drove home, the sun was gone and the horizon glowed red like molten glass. The thought of that door wouldn't leave him. He kept hearing that hollow clang in his head, the way it had echoed under the bucket. At home, he showered, ate a sandwich in silence, and sat at his kitchen table staring at his calloused hands. He'd seen enough during his service overseas to know when something was meant to stay hidden. Sleep came late. In the dark, he dreamed of the hillside breathing through that narrow seam, whispering secrets it had kept for 40 years. The next morning, the crew was sluggish. The heat came earlier, thicker. Dale barked orders to move the grading equipment farther down the slope, away from the concrete section. "We'll let the suits deal with that door when they bother showing up," he said. But when noon came and no one from the district office arrived, curiosity started eating at them again. They all felt it, the strange pull of something left buried. After lunch, as the others smoked by the trailers, Mark found himself drifting back toward the trench. He stood over the slab, his shadow cutting across the dull gray surface. He crouched, pressed his ear near the hinge, and for an instant he swore he heard a faint resonance, like air moving through space. He told himself it was nothing, just wind, pressure, or imagination. Yet his fingers itched for a tool. When the shift ended and the others headed for their trucks, he waited until the sound of engines faded. Only one man stayed behind. Javier, the bulldozer operator, always the last to leave. Mark called out quietly, "You got a minute?" Javier grinned. "You want to take another look, don't you?" Mark didn't answer. The two of them returned to the trench as twilight spread across the sky. They parked the truck close, switched on the headlights, and the beams sliced through the settling dust. The concrete door gleamed faintly, half uncovered, as if waiting. Mark fetched a crowbar and a small sledge from the toolbox. "We're not breaking it," he said, "just testing the seam." They scraped away the remaining clay along the edges, revealing the outline in full, a thick slab with steel bands embedded in the corners. Near the center was a recessed handle slot packed with old sealant. It took several minutes of careful work before the tip of the crowbar found the groove. The first pull produced only a creak. The second, deeper one, made the metal groan, followed by a puff of cold air that smelled faintly of oil and dust. Javier stepped back. "Jesus, it's really a door." Mark nodded, his pulse quickening. The air coming out was unmistakably stale, yet breathable, heavy with time. He shone his flashlight into the narrow opening. The beam disappeared into darkness. The walls beyond looked smooth, man-made. They didn't go further. Not yet. The door was too heavy to move without proper equipment, and neither of them wanted to be the one caught trespassing on who knows what. Mark sealed it back as best he could, pressing clay into the crack to disguise the opening. When they left the site that night, the door looked almost untouched again, buried under a thin layer of red dust. But both men knew it was there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Driving down the dirt road, Mark glanced once more in the rearview mirror. The hill behind him glowed orange under the last light, the machines like sleeping beasts along its flank. The secret inside the earth had woken something in him, too, something restless. He didn't know it yet, but the door he'd uncovered wasn't just part of an old structure. It was the beginning of a trail that would reach back into the darkest corners of his country's recent past, and straight into his own life. The highway project would keep moving forward, burying the land under layers of concrete and asphalt, but beneath it, the truth had already begun to breathe again. And, as the first night insects started their chorus over the empty field, the faint echo of that hollow clang seemed to follow him all the way home. The following evening came heavy with humidity. The clouds hung low over the hills, bruised and swollen, promising rain that never seemed to arrive. The air smelled of metal and dust, and the machinery on the site stood motionless, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Most of the men had left early, tired of the heat, of the silence, of the mystery that had settled like a weight over the place since the discovery of the concrete slab. But Mark Wilson had stayed behind. He told Dale that his excavator needed refueling, though the tank was already full. It was a simple excuse, enough to keep him near the trench as the light faded and the sounds of the highway melted into the distance. Javier had promised to meet him again after dark. The two men hadn't spoken much during the day, but the unspoken agreement hung between them like a shared secret. Something had been left unfinished the night before, and both of them knew that once the others forgot about the door, it would be up to them to see what lay beyond. When the last pickup rumbled off toward town, Mark shut down the generator, leaving only the ticking sound of cooling engines. He stood still for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of cicadas in the brush. Then headlights cut through the darkness from behind, a battered Dodge truck pulling up beside the slope. Javier stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. "Figured you'd still be here," he said quietly, the beam of his light catching the sweat on his brow. "You really think there's something inside?" Mark nodded. "It's not just a wall, there's space behind it. Air's coming through. You felt it too." Javier wiped his palms on his jeans. "All right then, let's see what we're dealing with before someone else decides to claim it." They parked the truck at an angle, headlights aimed down into the trench. The white beams spread across the dirt, showing the rough edge of the door, now half covered again by the red dust from the day's grading. The concrete glimmered faintly in the artificial light, scarred and ancient, the exposed hinges like bones jutting out from the earth. Mark knelt and brushed away the loose soil. The same smell rose again, stale, mineral, tinged with the faint sweetness of something long enclosed. He could feel the cool air seeping through the cracks, steady and patient like breath. He retrieved a hammer and a small chisel from his toolbox, then began working the sealant around the metal groove. The black, tar-like material crumbled easily, breaking away in sticky chunks. When he struck the hinge with the hammer, a dull echo traveled through the slab, deep and resonant, suggesting a hollow space behind it. It took them nearly an hour to clear enough of the seam to wedge in the crowbar. Javier grunted as he forced the handle upward, his muscles straining under the weight. The door groaned, an old, pained sound that made both men freeze. Dust fell from the edges in soft, lazy drifts. Mark leaned in, grabbed the metal edge, and together they pulled. The hinges shrieked, metal grinding against metal, until finally the door gave way with a heavy shudder. The air that escaped was cold and thick. It carried the smell of rust, oil, and age, a smell that seemed too heavy for the open night. Mark lifted his flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam caught a narrow corridor, the walls smooth and pale, made of poured concrete, still intact despite the years. The floor was covered with a fine layer of dust, undisturbed except for a single scuff mark, as if someone had once turned and closed the door from the inside. Javier exhaled slowly. Well, shit. It's a bunker. Mark didn't answer. He stepped forward, ducking under the low frame, his boots leaving crisp prints in the dust. The light reached farther now, illuminating the edges of what looked like a small room branching off to the right. Against the nearest wall stood a metal table and chair, both streaked with corrosion. A pile of newspapers sat neatly stacked in one corner, their edges yellowed and fragile. He picked one up carefully. The headline read, "Houston Infrastructure Expansion Project nears completion. Mayor Holloway praises local contractors." The date, August 1984. "Holy hell," Javier whispered behind him. "You know what this is?" Mark set the paper back down. A time capsule, or something worse. They moved deeper inside, their flashlights sweeping across the walls. The second room was larger, almost the size of a small garage. Shelves lined the far side, filled with wooden crates and metal boxes. Everything was covered in the same gray film of dust. Mark brushed one label clean. The black stencil letters read, "Property of City of Houston, Department of Infrastructure." Another crate bore the markings of a construction materials supplier, the same company name stamped on the slab outside. Javier pried open a lid with his crowbar. Inside were rows of glass bottles, their labels faded but still legible. "Imported cognac, vintage 1976. He whistled under his breath. "Guess the mayor had expensive taste." Mark's light drifted over the shelves to a smaller box in the corner. He crouched, brushed away the dust, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of watches, gold chains, and cufflinks, each neatly arranged on velvet. Some bore initials engraved on the back, others foreign hallmarks. It didn't look like city property. It looked personal. Stolen. He turned towards the table in the center of the room. A stack of files lay there, their edges curled but intact. The top sheet was a letter typed on official stationery. The first line caught his breath. to Mayor Richard C. Holloway concerning project fund reallocations. The signature at the bottom was from a state auditor, one whose death decades ago had been reported as accidental. "This place," Mark murmured, scanning the rest of the document. "It's not just storage. It's evidence." They found more as they moved. Old invoices with altered numbers, check stubs linking city accounts to private companies, lists of materials that never reached any project site. One file bore a label in red marker: Dam Project, Confidential. Inside was a spreadsheet of figures detailing the exact siphoning of federal construction funds. Each page bore initials next to the altered totals, initials that matched names of contractors still active today. Javier leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "You think this is what he hid when they came after him? The mayor? This is the stuff he didn't want anyone to find." "Looks like it," Mark said quietly, "and no one ever did until now." They moved through one more doorway into a smaller side room. It was colder there, the air still enough to make their flashlights' beams seem solid. A small cot stood in the corner, a folded blanket at its foot. On the wall above it, a single framed photograph hung askew. It showed a man in a dark suit shaking hands with a line of workers in hard hats. The man's smile was confident, practiced, the same face that had once appeared in newspapers across the state. Holloway. Next to the cot stood a safe. It was squat, heavy, painted green, its combination dial still intact. Mark ran his hand over the surface. Dust came away thick on his fingertips. There were scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had once tried to open it in a hurry and failed. "Think you can crack it?" Javier asked, half joking. Mark shook his head. "Not here. Not without the right tools." They lingered in silence for a moment, listening to the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the structure. The sound echoed softly, fading into the walls. Then Javier turned toward him. "We should tell Dale, or the cops. This is big." Mark hesitated. His flashlight moved back to the papers spread across the table. The logos, the signatures, the dollar amounts, all of it painted a picture of greed and corruption that had been buried along with the bunker. "You think they'll believe two guys from a road crew? They'll just lock this place up and pretend it's nothing, same as they did 40 years ago. Then what do you suggest?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gathered the nearest file folders and tucked them carefully into his backpack. "We'd take a few of these, just enough to prove what's here. The rest stays, for now." By the time they stepped outside again, the night had deepened. The clouds had split open, releasing a thin mist that settled over the hills. The lights from their truck looked muted through the drizzle, reflecting off the mud like streaks of silver. They sealed the door as best they could, pressing fresh clay into the seams and covering the surface with tarps and dirt until it looked again like a part of the hillside. Neither of them spoke on the drive back to town. The windshield wipers clicked rhythmically, cutting through the mist. Mark's mind churned with images of what they'd seen: the safe, the documents, the photograph on the wall. Every page he'd read echoed with the same thought. This wasn't just a relic of old crimes. It was a trail that could still destroy lives. When he reached his small apartment, he didn't turn on the lights. He set his backpack on the table, opened it, and pulled out the folder on top. The papers were damp from the humidity, the ink beginning to blur. He laid them out carefully, page by page. The names stared back at him: city officials, contractors, accountants. Some were familiar from old newspaper clippings, others from the current construction permits he'd seen at work. Different generation, same families. The Holloway influence hadn't vanished, it had merely changed its face. He sat for hours reading through the files. Among them he found something that froze him, a deposition copy bearing the signature of a man named Gerald Reeves. Mark recognized the name instantly. Gerald had been his late friend's father, a man whose life had unraveled after being accused of embezzlement in 1983. Everyone had called it an open and shut case, but here was the truth, written in bureaucratic ink. Reeves had been the whistleblower. He'd exposed the falsified budgets, and for that he'd been framed. The file even contained a brief memo from Holloway himself, noting that R should be handled quietly. Mark pushed back from the table, his heart pounding. He looked at the rain sliding down the window pane, at the reflection of his own face in the glass. He thought of Reeves's son, the man who died working the same kind of job Mark was doing now, crushed in a construction accident 10 years ago. All those years, his family had carried the weight of guilt and shame for something that wasn't their fault. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. Mark gathered the papers, slipped them into a plastic envelope, and hid them behind the panel under his sink. He didn't know what he would do yet, only that he couldn't walk away. Not now. The next morning, the site looked different. New orange markers had appeared near the slope, and a white pickup truck with tinted windows was parked at the far end of the lot. 2 men in clean work boots stood by it, talking to Dale. They wore pressed shirts, no helmets, no badges. When they saw Mark, they paused for a moment too long. One of them nodded slightly, like a man acknowledging a debt yet to be paid. Dale called everyone together and told them to stay clear of the northern section until the environmental guys finished their inspection. He didn't sound convinced himself. As Mark climbed into his excavator, the sound of the bucket hitting the ground felt different now. The soil was no longer just soil. It was a lid over something that was never meant to be found. Beneath his boots, the earth held secrets written in ink and greed, secrets that had survived 4 decades of silence. And now he realized those secrets had begun to move again. That night, when he finally shut down his machine and stood alone by the trench, he looked at the faint mound of dirt where the bunker door lay hidden. The wind carried the scent of rain and rust. Somewhere in that darkness below, the papers still waited, whispering the names of men who had built their fortunes on lies. Mark knew then that he couldn't let them stay buried forever. The past, once disturbed, never really went back to sleep. By the 3rd morning after they opened the bunker, the entire site felt different. The air seemed heavier, the ground quieter, as if the earth itself was aware that something forbidden had been unearthed. The men on the crew no longer laughed or argued like before. They moved slower, glancing now and then toward the mound of red soil where the concrete door lay hidden under a tarp. No one spoke of it directly, but the tension hummed beneath every word, every movement, like a wire pulled too tight. Mark tried to focus on his work, yet the rhythmic grind of the excavator no longer brought him calm. Every time the bucket struck the dirt, he imagined it hitting another secret buried just beneath the surface. The documents he'd taken from the bunker were still at his apartment, tucked inside the envelope beneath the sink. He hadn't told anyone except Javier, and even then only the bare minimum. But as he worked, he kept thinking about those pages, about the names printed on them in fading ink, the companies, the signatures, the initials. The more he remembered, the clearer it became that the corruption hadn't died with Holloway's disappearance. It had evolved, changed hands, and taken root again under new faces and new titles. At lunch, the men sat in the shade of a bulldozer, eating in silence. Dale, the foreman, paced nearby with his phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone from the district office. "I already told you," Mark overheard him say. "We hit a slab, maybe an old bunker or something. Yeah, it's sealed again. No damage. You can send your inspectors if you want, but we're not stopping the grading for this." He hung up and cursed under his breath. When he noticed Mark watching, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't see nothing weird out here, right, Wilson?" Mark swallowed a mouthful of water, then nodded. "Just dirt and concrete, boss." "Good," Dale said, too quickly. "Let's keep it that way." But rumors had already begun to spread. That afternoon, a few of the younger workers came back to the trench after hours, claiming they wanted to look for scrap. When Mark returned to check on his equipment, he found them prying open one of the crates they'd dragged from the bunker before the door was resealed. Inside were bottles of brandy and a set of brass candlesticks wrapped in old linen. One man laughed, holding up a silver watch that glimmered in the sunlight. "You believe this? We're sitting on a goddamn treasure." Mark froze. He felt anger rise like heat in his chest. "Put that back," he said quietly. "All of it." The man frowned. "Relax, man. It's just junk. Nobody's claimed it in 40 years. "Doesn't mean it's yours," Mark said, stepping closer. The others shifted uneasily, muttering, but something in his voice made them relent. They dropped the watch and backed away, leaving the open crate behind. Mark covered it again with the tarp, but he knew it wouldn't stop them from coming back. Greed had a way of spreading fast, especially among men who'd never seen real wealth up close. That night, he drove to town to clear his head. He stopped at a diner off the highway, ordered coffee, and sat near the window. The rain had started again, streaking the glass in diagonal lines. A television over the counter played an old local news segment, a retrospective about the Holloway Dam, celebrating its 40th anniversary. The smiling face of the long-vanished mayor filled the screen, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, promising prosperity. The caption read, "Legacy of Progress, remembering Mayor Richard Holloway." Mark stared at the screen, unable to look away. The voice of the anchor praised Holloway's visionary leadership, the jobs he'd created, the infrastructure that had shaped modern Houston. There was no mention of the scandal that followed, of the missing funds, or of the people destroyed along the way. To the public, Holloway was still a hero. The truth lay buried in that bunker under layers of clay and silence. He finished his coffee and left a few bills on the counter. As he stepped outside, the rain had turned to mist, curling low over the asphalt. He took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number saved months ago from a veterans outreach seminar, a freelance journalist named Eric Larson who sometimes covered government fraud cases. Mark hesitated for a long moment before typing a message. "Need to talk. Found something about Holloway. Not safe to explain here." He hit send and waited. Minutes passed before a reply appeared. "Meet me tomorrow. Send location." When Mark got home, he locked the door and went straight to the sink. He pulled out the envelope, spread the contents across the table, and turned on a single lamp. The light fell across the yellowing papers like morning sun through fog. He began sorting them by type: financial ledgers, contractor lists, invoices. Many bore the official seal of the city of Houston. Others were private correspondence between Holloway and various businessmen. But it was one folder in particular that made him pause. It was thinner than the others, marked only with 2 letters scrawled in black ink. RR inside were 3 pages, typed statements from a man named Gerald Reeves, followed by a handwritten note labeled for personal file. Mark read the first line and felt his chest tighten. It was dated 1983. Reeves had been an engineer assigned to the dam project, and his testimony described how he'd discovered falsified supply records and confronted the mayor's aides. He'd written, "I believe federal funds are being diverted into private accounts. If anything happens to me, my wife Evelyn knows the details." The second page was a memo signed by Holloway himself, addressed to the Office of Public Relations. It stated plainly, Reeves's allegations must be contained. Arrange a dismissal and ensure narrative aligns with theft of company assets. Discredit where necessary. Mark closed his eyes. He remembered the name now. Gerald Reeves, the same man whose son, Thomas, had been his friend in the Army. Thomas had spoken of his father only once, saying he'd been set up by crooks in suits and died a broken man. Mark hadn't believed it then. Now the proof was in his hands. He read the pages again and again until the words blurred together. Every instinct told him to take them to the authorities, but another voice warned him otherwise. The same people who'd buried the truth once might still hold power. If they knew what he had, they wouldn't hesitate to bury him too. Sleep came late that night, and when it did, it was shallow, haunted by images of the bunker. He dreamed of the door closing behind him, of the walls breathing, of papers fluttering in a wind that came from nowhere. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. At the site the next morning, things had taken a strange turn. 2 white SUVs were parked near the trailers, their engines idling. Men in clean shirts and sunglasses stood nearby talking to Dale. Mark noticed how stiffly Dale's posture had changed, his usual gruff confidence replaced by nervous politeness. When Mark approached, one of the strangers turned his head slightly, his gaze following him with the casual alertness of someone trained to notice threats. "Morning," Dale said, forcing a grin. "These gentlemen are from the State Environmental Board. They're just checking the soil quality before we pour concrete." Mark nodded slowly. Didn't know the state cared that much about dirt. The taller man smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "We care about everything under this road, Mr. Wilson. You'd be surprised how deep that concern goes." Mark held his gaze for a moment before turning away. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed into his excavator. He knew then that someone, somewhere, had already found out. Maybe one of the workers who'd taken souvenirs had talked. Maybe Dale had mentioned the discovery to the wrong person. Either way, the secret was no longer theirs. That evening, when the site finally emptied, Mark found Javier waiting near the parking lot, leaning against his truck. His face was tense. "You see those suits today?" he asked quietly. "They're not from any environmental board. I checked the state website. No inspection scheduled here for weeks." Mark nodded. "They're here because of the bunker. I think they're looking for the documents." Javier hesitated. "Look, man, I didn't take anything, I swear. But some of the others did. Watches, bottles, whatever they could grab. Now 2 of them didn't show up today. Phones off, no word from their families." A chill crawled down Mark's spine. "You think those men—" "I don't think," Javier interrupted. "I know something's wrong. You should get rid of whatever you took. Burn it if you have to." But Mark couldn't. The papers weren't just evidence of theft. They were proof of innocence for a man whose family had been destroyed. "I can't destroy it," he said quietly. "Not this. There's truth here." Javier shook his head. "Truth gets people killed, brother. You know that." Mark didn't argue. They parted without another word. Back at his apartment, he found a new voicemail on his phone. The voice was male, calm, polite. "Mr. Wilson, this is a courtesy call from the Department of Transportation Oversight Committee. We'd like to ask a few questions regarding your current project. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." The number displayed had no area code, only a string of zeros. He deleted the message immediately, heart hammering. Then he sat at the table again, staring at the folder marked RR. He couldn't run anymore. The story had already caught him. Tomorrow he would meet the journalist, show him the papers, and let the truth out. But outside, somewhere beyond his window, an engine idled for a long time before driving away. He didn't see the car, only the faint reflection of headlights moving across the wet glass. The sound lingered long after the street had gone quiet. That night, as thunder rolled distantly over the Texas plains, Mark lay awake, listening to every creak of his apartment. He thought of the men who had vanished, of the ones in sunglasses pretending to be inspectors, of the file hidden beneath his floorboards. Every instinct told him danger was closing in, but he also knew there was no turning back. The bunker had been a grave for the truth once. He wouldn't let it become one again. When dawn finally broke, pale and uncertain, he made his decision. The files would go to the press. Whatever happened next, at least someone besides him would know what had been buried beneath that highway. He gathered the papers carefully, sealed them in a plastic bag, and placed them in his backpack. Then he stepped outside into the damp morning air, unaware that the real storm was only just beginning. The next day dawned gray and restless. The sky over the highway cut was smeared with thin clouds, the air thick enough to taste. The ground itself seemed to hum beneath the machines, like the earth was bracing for something. Mark arrived early, before the others, hoping for a quiet start. But as he pulled his truck into the lot, he saw them already there. 3 black SUVs parked side by side near the trailers, polished and gleaming, their tinted windows reflecting nothing but the pale morning light. He slowed his truck instinctively. The men standing beside the vehicles didn't look like anyone from the Department of Transportation. Their posture was wrong, too rigid, too alert. They wore plain suits, dark sunglasses, earpieces just barely visible beneath their collars. They didn't belong on a construction site, and everyone knew it. Dale was standing near them, hands on his hips, trying to sound authoritative but failing. Even from a distance, Mark could tell his voice had that sharp edge of nervousness. He killed the engine and stepped out, pretending to check his phone while keeping one eye on the group. The tallest of the men turned his head slightly in his direction. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. The man gave a polite, almost friendly nod, but it felt like a warning. The rest of the crew began to trickle in, their chatter low and uncertain. Dale called them together soon after, his tone forcedly casual. "Listen up, fellas," he said, waving a clipboard. "We got a temporary inspection from the State Environmental Division. Just routine stuff. Nothing to worry about. They're going to run some checks on the north end, so stay clear of that area for now." The men murmured in confusion, but no one argued. They'd all seen the suits. They'd all noticed the guns holstered under their jackets. Mark climbed into his excavator and pretended to start working, though he kept his eyes on the hillside. 2 of the visitors disappeared behind the tarps covering the bunker side. One stayed outside, speaking quietly into a radio. By mid-morning, the noise of engines and drills filled the air again, but it couldn't drown out the unease. Every worker on that site could feel it, the invisible line that had been drawn around the hill. At noon, Dale called for an early lunch break. He looked pale, sweat gathering along his collar despite the cool breeze. When Mark approached him, he tried to smile. "You ever see inspectors like that before?" Mark asked. Dale snorted, trying to sound casual. "Government's got inspectors for everything these days. Don't read too much into it." "They armed, too?" That question froze Dale for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Look, Wilson, I don't know what's going on, and I don't want to. They said this is above our clearance. Let's just keep our heads down." Mark didn't push further. He walked away, but the answer, or lack of one, stuck with him. When he looked up the slope again, one of the men in suits was watching him. It wasn't curiosity in the man's eyes, it was calculation. After lunch, a low drone filled the air, a helicopter sweeping past, slow and deliberate, before veering off toward the east. The crew paused, watching it disappear. No one spoke. Something was shifting, closing in around them. By sunset, the SUVs were still there, engines idling quietly. The men didn't leave. They stayed even after the crew packed up, pretending to review maps by the trailers. Dale told everyone to go home, his voice trembling slightly now. "Take the south exit, not the main road," he added, as if the route mattered. Mark lingered by his truck, pretending to check his tires while he watched one of the men pull out a phone and start snapping photos of the equipment. When their eyes met again, the man smiled faintly, almost mocking, before turning away. That night, Mark couldn't shake the image from his mind. He knew they hadn't come for an environmental inspection. They were here to erase something. And maybe someone. He spent the next few hours pacing his apartment, replaying every event since they'd opened the bunker. He should have destroyed the papers, like Javier said, but he couldn't. They were all he had to prove what happened, to prove that men like Holloway had built their fortunes on lies, and that good men like Gerald Reeves had paid the price. The phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Javier. "They took the crates, every one of them, loaded into trucks tonight. We're done here, man. Get rid of what you got." Mark didn't reply. Instead, he went to the sink, reached behind the panel, and pulled out the envelope. He stared at the faded city seals, the names of companies still operating under new banners. He thought about Reeves's widow, about her silence all these years. And he thought about the men in suits, how calm they looked, how certain. He turned on his laptop and began scanning each document, uploading them to a secure cloud drive linked to an encrypted account he'd used during his service. It was slow work, and each sound outside made him flinch. Around midnight, headlights flickered through the blinds. A car rolled slowly down his street, stopped briefly across from his apartment, then moved on. By the time the last page was scanned, the rain had started again, soft and steady. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the screen. The truth was there now, preserved, even if they came for the originals. He leaned back and closed his eyes, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. When he arrived at work the next morning, the bunker was gone. The tarps had been removed, the dirt freshly packed and leveled, tire marks leading away from the site. Dale stood nearby talking to a new supervisor, a man Mark had never seen before, dressed too well for the job. When Mark approached, the man extended a hand with a politician's smile. "Mr. Wilson, right? I'm told you're one of our most reliable operators." "That's me," Mark said carefully. "Good. We appreciate that kind of professionalism. There's been a bit of confusion here, but everything's under control now. You can resume normal operations tomorrow. For today, just head on home. Paid day off." Mark looked past him at the flattened slope. The entrance, the hinges, the door, all erased. "What happened to the environmental inspection?" he asked. The man's smile didn't falter. "Oh, that's been resolved. Turns out it wasn't anything important. You'll find this area perfectly safe now." He turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing in the dust. When he looked around, the rest of the crew avoided his eyes. Some packed up early, others pretended to check their machines. The silence felt final, like a grave being sealed. That evening, Javier showed up at his apartment, face drawn and pale. "You were right," he said before Mark could speak. "They weren't inspectors. They were here to clean up. Two of our guys, Mike and Luis, they didn't just quit. Their wives filed missing person reports today." Mark's stomach dropped. "What?" "Cops said they probably skipped town, but Mike's truck is still in his driveway." The two men sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of thunder. Finally, Javier leaned forward. "You still got those papers, don't you?" Mark hesitated. "Some of them." "Then listen to me. You need to get out. Tonight. I've seen this before. Back home in Mexico. Powerful people, money, the law looking the other way. You can't fight it alone." Mark looked at him, weary but steady. "I'm not fighting it alone. I've got a contact, a journalist. I'm meeting him tomorrow in Austin." Javier rubbed his face. "You think the press can protect you?" "I think the truth can." Javier stood, shaking his head. "Truth don't mean much if you're buried with it." He paused at the door. "Be careful, hermano. Don't trust anyone who shows up smiling." When he was gone, Mark sat for a long time staring at the rain-streaked window. He wanted to believe the journalist would listen, that the story would reach someone beyond the reach of the men in suits. But doubt gnawed at him. He'd seen too much to think justice came easy. Late that night, as he double-checked the files on his flash drive, a soft knock sounded at the door. He froze. 3 knocks, then silence. Slowly, he crossed the room and looked through the peephole. No one. Only the corridor stretching empty toward the stairs. When he opened the door, there was nothing but a plain white envelope lying on the floor. Inside was a single piece of paper with no letterhead, no signature, just one typed line. "Stop digging, Mr. Wilson. Some things are better left in the ground." He stared at the message for a long time before crumpling it in his hand. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the wet streets for a heartbeat before darkness swallowed them again. The next morning, he left town. He drove west toward Austin, his truck heavy with mud and silence. Every car behind him made his pulse quicken. Every turn in the road felt like it could be the last one before something went wrong. But he kept going, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender would mean the story would die the same way Holloway's victims had, buried beneath concrete, unmarked, forgotten. As the highway stretched before him, endless and gray under the storm clouds, Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. The past was behind him now, but its shadow was long, and he knew it was following close behind. The road to Austin was long and gray beneath the pale morning light, and the rain had finally stopped by the time Mark reached the outskirts of the city. The clouds still hung low, dull and heavy, and the wet asphalt shimmered faintly in the dawn. He hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, and the exhaustion made his mind buzz like static. But there was no turning back now. Every mile that rolled under his tires pulled him further from the site and deeper into whatever waited ahead. The flash drive with the scanned documents rested inside the glove compartment, wrapped in an old rag. The physical papers, the originals, were in a duffel bag beside him. He kept glancing at them like a man checking a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He'd arranged the meeting the night before. The journalist, Erik Larson, had agreed to meet him in a quiet cafe just outside downtown, a place near the river where the hum of traffic could drown out conversation. No recordings, Erik had texted. Bring what you have. If it's what you say, I'll know what to do with it. Those words had sounded confident on the screen, but now, as Mark parked his truck a block away and looked around the empty street, he wasn't sure if confidence was the same as safety. He entered the cafe just after 9. The place smelled of roasted beans and damp wood. There were only a few customers, a young couple whispering over their phones, an old man reading a newspaper, and behind the counter, a barista humming under her breath. At a corner table sat a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a beard trimmed close to the jaw. He looked up when Mark entered, nodded once, and gestured toward the seat across from him. "Wilson," he said quietly as Mark sat down. "You've had an interesting week?" Mark didn't respond right away. He studied the man carefully. Erik Larson looked exactly like his profile photo. Steady, alert, but with a weariness that suggested he'd seen too many stories end badly. "You read what I sent?" Mark asked. "Enough to know you've got something real." Erik leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The Holloway files. Those names, they're not just old ghosts. Some of those companies still have state contracts today. Roads, housing, energy. If these documents are genuine, it's a bomb." "They're genuine," Mark said. "I found them myself, hidden in a bunker under a construction site. They tried to erase it, buried it again 2 days ago." Erik's eyes narrowed slightly. "You said they. Who's they?" "Men in suits. Said they were inspectors. They weren't. They cleaned the place out, took everything. A couple of workers from our crew are missing, and they know I have these." The journalist exhaled slowly. "You understand what that means, right? If these people are still connected, they won't just walk away. Holloway may be gone, but his network isn't. The money kept flowing. You stumbled into a pipeline that's still open." Mark rubbed his temples. "Then it needs to stop. That's the idea." Erik reached for his bag and pulled out a small recorder. "I know you said no recordings, but I need something to reference later. Off the record, no names." Mark hesitated, then nodded. He spent the next hour recounting everything: the day they hit the concrete slab, the discovery of the bunker, the crates of stolen goods, the documents, the visits from the so-called inspectors. He told him about Gerald Reeves, the framed engineer, and his friend Thomas, and about the 2 workers who had vanished after talking too much. Erik listened without interrupting, jotting notes occasionally, his brow furrowed deeper with each detail. When Mark finished, the journalist leaned back and looked out the window. "Jesus, you realize you're holding proof of one of the biggest municipal fraud cases in Texas history." "I'm not holding proof," Mark said quietly. "I'm holding a death sentence if we don't move fast." Erik nodded slowly. "Then we move fast." He packed up his notes and slipped the flash drive into his pocket. "I'll make copies, send them to multiple outlets, not just mine. That way, even if someone tries to shut me up, it won't matter. The information will already be out there." Mark felt a flicker of relief, small but real. And the people who did this, if we're lucky, they'll panic and start covering their tracks. That's when we get names, movements, transfers. You can't take them head on, Mark. You expose them piece by piece. They shook hands before parting ways. Erik promised to call in a day, maybe 2. "Stay somewhere off the radar," he advised. "Don't go back to your apartment, and don't contact anyone from the site. Mark drove until he found a cheap roadside motel off the interstate. The place smelled of bleach and cigarettes, but the bed was clean enough. He pulled the curtains tight, laid the duffel bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the mattress. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest. When he woke, the light outside was already dimming. He checked his phone. No messages from Eric yet. Instead, there was one unread notification from an unknown number. "We know where you are." His heart stuttered. He stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it, though it didn't erase the chill crawling up his spine. He didn't turn on the light. Through the thin motel walls, he could hear a television in the next room, muffled laughter, a car starting outside. Everything sounded ordinary. And that made it worse. The call from Eric came early the next morning. His voice was strained, hushed. "They're already moving," he said. "I sent copies to 3 editors, but one of them got cold feet. Said someone from the state attorney's office warned them off. Mark, these people have reach. What do we do?" "Keep pressure. There's someone you need to meet. Gerald Reeves's widow. She's still alive. She never stopped trying to clear his name. She'll confirm everything. I'll text you her address." 2 hours later, Mark was on the road again, heading southeast toward Houston. The highways were familiar now, endless ribbons of gray cutting through the low fields and waterlogged ditches. He stopped only once at a gas station, where he bought coffee and glanced at a newspaper stand. On the front page, a small headline caught his eye. "Construction site temporarily closed following safety violation." No mention of the bunker, no mention of the men in suits. The silence was as deliberate as it was suffocating. When he reached the outskirts of Houston, the neighborhoods changed from glass office parks to tired houses with peeling paint. The address led him to a trailer park at the edge of town. The air was heavy with humidity and the faint smell of motor oil. He found the trailer number easily, faded digits painted crookedly above the door. A woman answered after his second knock. She was in her late 60s, her hair gray and pulled back tightly, her face lined but strong. "You're the one Eric sent," she said before he could introduce himself. "Come in." The inside of the trailer was neat but worn. Old photographs lined the shelves, a younger woman with a man in a hard hat, a family picnic, a boy with a fishing pole. Mark recognized the face of Gerald Reeves from the newspaper clipping he'd seen in the file. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask about him," the woman said. The truth was always there, just buried where no one wanted to dig. Mark explained what he had found, the documents, the bunker, the missing workers. As he spoke, she listened silently, her eyes glistening. When he finished, she went to a drawer and pulled out a folder wrapped in plastic. "He kept copies," she said softly. "Gerald knew they'd destroy everything. These are the letters he wrote to the Attorney General. No one ever answered." The pages were brittle, the ink fading, but the words were clear enough. They matched everything in the Holloway files, identical figures, identical signatures. The proof was absolute. Mark felt the weight of it settle on him. "Your husband tried to do the right thing," he said quietly. "They ruined him for it," she replied, "and they'll ruin you too if you let them." He nodded. "Not if I get this out fast enough." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Then promise me something. When this is over, don't forget the people who got buried along the way. The workers, the engineers, the ones who didn't have your voice." "I won't," he said. Before leaving, she gave him one last item, a small cassette tape labeled "For Evelyn." "He recorded it a week before they arrested him," she said. I never had the courage to listen. Maybe it's time someone did." That night, in his motel room, Mark found an old tape player among the belongings in the closet. He inserted the cassette and pressed play. For a few seconds, only static filled the air. Then a man's voice, trembling but steady, broke through. "If you're hearing this," Gerald Reeves said, "it means I failed to stop them. They're taking everything. The records, the payments, the names. Holloway thinks he's untouchable. But the paper trail is in the damn contracts, in the supply orders. Someone will find it, someday. Don't let them forget." Mark sat in silence long after the tape ended. The rain had started again outside, tapping against the window like a slow heartbeat. Somewhere far away, sirens wailed. He felt a strange calm settle over him. Not peace, but purpose. The story was bigger than him now. It had started with one man trying to tell the truth, and now it would end the same way. He picked up his phone and called Eric. "I have the widow's testimony," he said, "and more proof. Letters, a recording. We're past the point of no return." Eric's voice on the other end was quiet but resolute. "Then we finish this. I'm setting up a secure handoff to a national outlet. Once it's live, they can't bury it again." Mark looked out the window at the rain, the neon glow of the motel sign flickering across the wet pavement. "Make it fast," he said. "They're already hunting." When he hung up, he realized his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something sharper, cleaner. For the first time, he could see a path through the dark. Yet he also knew that the truth never came without a price. Outside, a pair of headlights slid slowly past the motel and stopped. The engine idled for a moment, then drove away. He stayed awake until dawn, listening to the rain fade into silence, waiting for the knock that hadn't yet come. Morning broke without light. The sky was a dull steel, and a thin fog lay over the city, creeping low along the highways like breath from something sleeping underground. Mark drove west again, this time toward the warehouse district on the edge of town, where he'd arranged to meet Eric for the final handoff. The motel room behind him was stripped bare. No bags, no trace, only the faint imprint of his boots on the carpet. He didn't look back when he turned the key in the ignition. The roads were nearly empty. A tanker rolled by, its wheels hissing against the wet asphalt. A radio announcer droned about a brush fire near San Marcos, but the sound barely registered. Mark's mind was fixed on one thing, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside him. Inside were the remaining original documents from the Holloway bunker, the ones he hadn't scanned or shared. He'd kept them as insurance, though he knew they might as well be a target painted on his back. He'd barely slept in the past 2 nights. Between the phone messages, the idling cars outside his window, and the constant feeling of being watched, rest had become impossible. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound sharpened. The only thing keeping him steady was motion. Keep moving, he told himself. Keep the truth alive long enough to matter. Eric's voice echoed in his head from their last call. Once the files go public, they can't bury it again. It had sounded simple then, almost hopeful, but hope was a fragile thing in a world built on lies. When he reached the warehouse, Eric's car was already there, a faded blue sedan parked under the skeletal branches of a mesquite tree. The journalist stood outside smoking, his face pale in the gray light. He waved when he saw Mark approach, but there was no smile this time. "You're early," Eric said, flicking the cigarette to the ground. "Didn't sleep," Mark replied. "Neither did I." The journalist's voice was low, clipped. "It's getting dangerous, Mark. After you left town, I got a call from someone claiming to be with the state attorney's office. He wanted to know if I'd been in contact with you. He used your full name." Mark's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I hung up, but there's more." Eric reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. "They're already controlling the narrative. Look at this." Mark unfolded the paper. The headline read, "Construction worker under investigation for theft of government property." Below it was a blurry photo of him taken from his ID badge. The article claimed he'd stolen classified materials from a federal construction site and was wanted for questioning. His chest tightened as he scanned the lines. Every sentence twisted the truth, painting him as a criminal, not a witness. "They're framing me," he said quietly. Eric nodded. "And they're good at it. This isn't some local smear job. Someone high up wants this buried. They'll use everything. Your past, your service record, anything they can twist. You're not safe here." Mark folded the paper and set it down. "We can still finish this. I'm not saying we can't, but we have to be smart." Eric glanced around, his eyes restless. "I've set up a meeting with a contact from the Federal Bureau of Investigations. She's clean, been working corruption cases for years. If she gets these files, it forces them into the open. Once there's a federal case number, they can't shut it down without leaving fingerprints." "When?" "Tonight. In Austin. I'll drive there now, make sure it's clear. You stay low until I call." Mark nodded slowly. "And if you don't call?" Eric gave a faint, humorless smile. "Then you run." They parted ways in silence. Mark watched him drive off, the sedan disappearing into the fog like a ghost. For a long moment, he stayed there, listening to the ticking of his engine, the sound of rain beginning to fall again. Then he pulled out his phone and powered it down. No GPS, no trace. He started the truck and headed toward the back roads leading out of town. The rain grew heavier, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. He passed a stretch of abandoned houses, their windows boarded and sagging. Every so often he caught sight of headlights in his mirror, distant and uncertain. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. He turned off the main road, taking a winding route through farmland. His tires sprayed mud onto the tall weeds at the roadside, the engine straining against the climb. By late afternoon, he reached an old railway depot where he sometimes volunteered with a group of veterans restoring train cars. The place was empty. The yard silent, except for the creak of metal in the wind. It was the perfect place to hide the evidence. Inside one of the storage sheds, behind a row of rusted toolboxes, he found a narrow cavity in the wall. He wrapped the remaining papers in plastic and slid them inside. If anyone came for him, they wouldn't find everything. When he stepped back outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, streaks of light cutting through. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of peace. Then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Against his better judgment, he powered it on. One message blinked across the screen. It wasn't from Eric. "We can end this quietly, Mr. Wilson. Return what you took, and no one gets hurt." His throat went dry. The sender was unknown, the number blocked. Beneath the message was a second one arriving seconds later, a photo. His mother's house in Houston, the porch lights glowing faintly in the dusk. Mark stood frozen. He felt the weight of the world tilt beneath him. They had found her. He called Eric immediately. No answer. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Still nothing. Panic clawed at his chest. He climbed back into the truck and started driving, faster now, heading toward the interstate. Rainwater splashed over the windshield and the wipers struggled to keep up. Every passing car felt like a shadow chasing him. He drove through the night, stopping only for gas. When dawn broke again, pale and uncertain, he was back in Houston. He turned down his mother's street, his stomach in knots. The house looked normal, peaceful even. The porch lights were still on, the same as in the photo. He climbed out, his hand instinctively reaching for the wrench under his seat. Inside, the house was empty. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. On the kitchen table sat a single envelope. His name was written on it in neat block letters. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a printed sheet of paper. No handwriting, no signature. "You're running out of time. People die for less." The sound of a car outside made him whirl around. Through the blinds, he saw a black sedan idling at the corner. It didn't move when he stepped onto the porch. It just sat there, engine running, the faint outline of someone behind the wheel. He took one slow step backward, then another. The car's headlights blinked once, then it rolled away. He locked the door and sat in the dark until sunset. He didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. It was clear now. This wasn't about stopping him. It was about breaking him, piece by piece, until he gave in. When his phone rang again, he almost didn't answer. But it was Eric. His voice was rough, frantic. "They know," he said. "The meeting's compromised. My contact never showed. Someone tipped them off. I barely got out." "Where are you?" "Heading north. I've got copies of everything on me, but they're closing in fast. I'm going to upload what I can to a secure server. Once it's live, we're covered." The line crackled. Then silence. Mark shouted into the phone, but there was no response. He tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. He sat there for a long time, staring at the dark screen, knowing what that likely meant. Hours passed before the news broke. A single paragraph buried deep in a local online article. Freelance journalist found dead after car crash near Waco. Authorities suspect mechanical failure. No name was given, but Mark didn't need one. He turned off his phone again, his hands trembling. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat still, listening to the rain beginning to fall again outside. The world had gone quiet around him, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. He thought about the bunker, about Gerald Reeves, about all the men who had died because they believed in truth. Maybe this was always how it ended, but somewhere beneath the despair, a small ember of resolve still burned. He opened his laptop and checked the encrypted drive Eric had used. It was empty for a moment, then a new folder appeared, time-stamped just minutes before the crash. Inside were files, dozens of them, copies of everything they'd gathered. Eric had done it. He'd sent it through before they caught him. Mark leaned back, staring at the screen. The truth had survived, but now it was his alone to protect. He closed the laptop and listened to the rain beat harder against the roof. The walls of the house felt thinner than ever, the air heavy with unseen eyes. He knew they wouldn't stop. They never did. But neither would he. Not now, not after everything. Somewhere beyond that rain, the city still hummed with life, unaware of the rot beneath its streets. And as night fell once more over Houston, Mark made a quiet vow. He would see it through, whatever it cost. The storm passed sometime after midnight, but the sound of the rain stayed with him long after it stopped. It was in his ears, in the back of his mind, the echo of everything that had happened. The truth was no longer just a set of papers. It was alive now, scattered across servers in the hands of journalists and lawyers and whoever else had picked it up before the darkness swallowed Eric's car. It wasn't his alone anymore, yet the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the glow of his laptop. The files were still there in the encrypted drive Eric had used, their titles lined up neatly, waiting. He had checked them a dozen times already, each time half expecting them to vanish. But they didn't. Eric had made sure of that. His last act before dying had been to push the truth beyond reach, past fear, past control. Mark knew it was enough to start something. Whether it would finish anything was another matter entirely. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Outside, dawn was beginning to press against the blinds, a pale, colorless light. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. The world was waking up as if nothing had changed, as if men hadn't died to expose the rot beneath its streets. He stood, stretched, and went to the window. The street looked the same as it always had, quiet, lined with the same cracked sidewalks and crooked mailboxes. But something was off. A van was parked halfway down, white, unmarked, the kind that belonged to electricians or movers, except there were no ladders on its roof and no one had stepped out of it since he'd noticed it the night before. He moved away from the window slowly, his pulse quickening. They were still watching. Maybe they had always been. He thought about leaving, driving somewhere north, changing his name, finding a new life. He could. He had money and cash, enough to get far, but wherever he went, the truth would still be tied to him. It wasn't just about Holloway anymore. It was about all of them. The Reeves family, the missing workers, Eric. Running would mean their lives meant nothing. He packed what little he had left, the flash drive, the backup laptop, and a photo of his mother from years ago when she still smiled easily. He left the rest. Before walking out, he scribbled a note on the counter. No words, just an address. The location of the hidden documents he'd buried at the railway depot. If they killed him, someone would eventually find it. Someone who cared enough to look. The day unfolded like a slow burn. The news began to trickle in around noon. The Holloway case was everywhere. Radio, television, the internet. Eric's files had made it out. Reporters were calling it the Hidden Highway Scandal. The mayor's descendants, several state officials, and at least 3 major contractors were named in connection with federal fraud investigations dating back 40 years. The story was unstoppable now, and the old city walls were crumbling. Mark listened from the driver's seat of his truck, parked by a gas station outside of town. Every word felt unreal. For a moment, he even smiled. Eric had done it. The truth was alive. But his name was part of it too. Former construction worker Mark Wilson, a veteran and whistleblower, discovered the evidence that reignited the case. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he heard the anchor's voice say his name aloud for the whole country to hear. He was no longer a ghost. The first call came minutes later. Unknown number. He let it ring. The second came 10 minutes after that, then another. They would come for him now, not because of what he still had, but because of who he was, the face attached to the story. By sunset, his face was everywhere. The media painted him as a reluctant hero, a man who had unearthed a secret and paid the price for it. But Mark knew better. There were no heroes, only survivors, and survival was a temporary condition. He drove to the veterans' warehouse one last time. The evening light poured across the rusted rail cars, warm and strange. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil, the scent of a place forgotten by time. He walked to the corner where he'd hidden the papers, knelt, and pulled them out. Still dry, still untouched. He stared at them for a long moment, wondering if this was what truth was supposed to feel like. Heavy, cold, and fragile all at once. A noise behind him made him turn. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He froze. A man stepped out of the shadows, middle-aged, dressed in a suit too fine for this place. His hands were empty, calm. "You've done enough, Mr. Wilson," he said softly. "It's over now." Mark didn't move. "You're with them." "I'm with the city," the man replied, smiling faintly. "Always have been. But things have changed. The story's out, and you've already won, haven't you? The people love a whistleblower. The Bureau's on it. The press is feeding. There's no reason to keep fighting." Mark took a step back. "You're not here to congratulate me." The man's eyes glinted. "No, I'm here to clean up. Everyone has to play their part, and yours is finished. You gave them the spark. Now it's our job to control the fire. You understand how this works, don't you? Control it. How? Contain it. Redirect it. By next month, this won't be about corruption anymore. It'll be about progress, reform, civic renewal, whatever headline they choose. The names will fade. The money will move. You'll be forgotten." Mark felt something inside him shift, a cold, steady anger. "Not if I'm still alive." The man sighed almost with pity. "That's the problem." Before Mark could react, another figure appeared at the far end of the warehouse, then another. 3 in total. The same suits he'd seen at the site months ago now, their faces unreadable. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, where the flash drive rested. "You kill me. It goes public again," he said. "Every copy I made, every file, it's out there." The first man smiled thinly. "And that's why you're not going to die tonight. You're just going to disappear." For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then Mark hurled the small metal drive into the shadows. It clattered across the floor, vanished beneath a heap of scrap. The men turned, instinctively following the sound. That was all he needed. He ran. The warehouse exploded into motion. Boots pounded the concrete behind him. He weaved between old train cars, his breath ragged, the smell of rust and oil thick in his throat. A shout echoed. Orders barked, sharp and clipped. He pushed through a side door, stumbling into the night air. The yard stretched out before him, empty, vast, framed by the dying light of dusk. He ran toward his truck, every step a prayer. A shot cracked behind him, then another. Sparks leapt from the metal siding near his shoulder. He ducked, sprinting harder. He could see the truck now, only yards away. He dove behind it as another shot rang out. The glass exploded, shards raining across the ground. He crawled low, reaching under the seat for the pistol he kept taped beneath. His fingers closed around the cold metal just as a shadow loomed beside the truck. He fired once, the sound deafening. The figure dropped wordlessly. Another shout, another shot. He didn't wait to see where it came from. He threw himself into the cab, twisted the key, and the engine roared to life. Tires screamed as he tore out of the yard, the headlights slicing through the dark. He didn't stop driving until the lights of the city disappeared behind him. The highway stretched ahead, endless and empty. His arm throbbed where a bullet had grazed him, blood soaking through his sleeve, but he kept one hand firm on the wheel. The world outside was a blur of rain and light, like driving through memory. Hours later, he pulled off onto a service road near the state line. The truck sputtered, dying at last. He sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, his breath shallow. The wound wasn't deep, but it burned. He looked out across the dark fields, listening to the sound of crickets rising in the still air. The phone on the seat buzzed again, a notification. He picked it up, half expecting another threat. Instead, it was a news alert. Federal prosecutor announces arrests in Holloway investigation. Family assets frozen pending trial. He laughed then, quietly, almost bitterly. The truth had made it. Somehow, despite everything, it had survived. Maybe not pure, maybe not whole, but alive. That was enough. He leaned back, closing his eyes. In the distance, the horizon began to pale, the first hint of morning. He thought of Eric, of Gerald Reeves, of the people whose names would finally be cleared. He thought of his mother's voice on the phone years ago, telling him that good men didn't need medals, only peace. When the sun finally rose, Mark stepped out of the truck. The air was clean, smelling of rain and earth. He walked a few yards into the tall grass and watched the light spread across the sky. For the first time in months, he felt something close to calm. He didn't know what would come next, the trials, the questions, the headlines. Maybe they'd twist the story again. Maybe his name would fade. But the lie was broken now, and the pieces could never fit the same way again. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the last photograph he owned, the one of Gerald Reeves standing by the dam, smiling at a world that had turned its back on him. He looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and slipped it back into his coat. The truth, he realized, wasn't a victory. It was a wound that had to stay open so the infection could drain. It hurt, and it would keep hurting, but maybe that was the point. He turned back toward the highway as the light grew stronger. The world was waiting, indifferent and wide. Somewhere behind him, the city would wake to headlines and justice and all the noise that followed. But out here, there was only the wind, the sound of it moving through the grass like a voice older than lies, older than fear. He walked toward it slowly, one step after another, until the road swallowed his shadow, and the past, at last, let him go. If this story kept you on the edge, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Share this video with someone who loves true mysteries, and stay tuned, because the next story will change everything.